Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Two words for you, really three words for you. Jon Reed, Diginomica. Two names you've heard me talk about a lot in this podcast. He's been on this podcast before. He's a guy, and that's a publication I've known for a long time now, and someone I really enjoy talking to. So, Jonathan, thanks for joining us today.
Pleasure, Eric. Seems like every time you and I clash perspectives, we learn something. It's always fascinating. We come at the market from different directions, but I think we always find something. And I don't know. I guess we're probably both aligned in the sense that we feel like customers never get enough value in our industry, and I think that's the common thread that keeps us kind of sparking, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. Keeps us having conversations like these just to dig into the good, the bad, the ugly of the industry. And I think
Exactly.
that's something I really appreciate having you on the show and just chatting with you in general. Just having a person like you as a sounding board in the industry, I think is super helpful and valuable because you're right. It's you need more people like yourself that can just tell it like it is. And you're one of the few people that does that. So I'm really excited to have a fellow maverick slash disruptor
All
slash
right.
nuisance or whatever people want to call us. Excited to have you here on the show today. But for those that don't know you, maybe some people have heard the name, maybe people have heard of Diginomica, maybe not. Tell us a little bit about yourself and about Diginomica, if you don't mind.
Well, let's keep this short so we can get into the meat of the topics, but we've been around for about 14 years, really focused on the issue of real world transformation. So what really matters for customers in our industry, and how do you get more successful products over the finish line? What do those look like? And what do the bad projects look like? And that's our broad editorial purview, I guess. And I got my chops in the ERP world, going back to the '90s. But my role at Diginomica has been pretty expansive in the sense that transformation leads in a lot of different directions. And then in the last few years, I've become kind of an AI geek, sort of a love hate thing, but definitely a deep research, because I felt like to really be effective and serve customers better, I needed to understand this particular technology. And so, so that's been a flavor in my coverage as well. I just put out a big piece on what's working and what's not in agentic AI projects, which we may refer to a little bit today. But anyway, so that kind of stuff keeps us all busy and active, and we're kind of straddle the fence between media and analyst firms. So we're starting to put out more and more of our own research, but we're trying to stay true to just trying to do things a little bit different. And we've survived a lot of waves of disruption ourselves, and hopefully we can keep doing that, because it hasn't been a super smooth ride for, I think, media enterprises. So it's kept us on our toes, but I'd like to think that we can keep going, because like you and I were discussing, it's like having those independent viewpoints and trying to build different kinds of business models in our industry that are more sustainable and driven by customer needs, and not like by big AI and big finance. So
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting about your background too, is that how you grew up in the SAP space too, right? I mean, that's really where when I first met you, maybe 20 years ago, you were pretty deep in SAP, but since then you've really broadened, and you're more like me now. I'd say you're kind of looking at all different types of technologies and trends as in that media influencer role that you have.
yeah, for sure. I mean, I always spent a lot of time with the ERP landscape in general, but I did have a lot going on in SAP in particular. But I guess you could say kind of outgrew that a little bit, although I still cover that company pretty closely. But it just made more sense as I evolved in my ambitions to try to be broader in how I looked at the market. And when you look at transformation, you really need to look at it end to end. So I needed to spend a lot more time with CX. Always spent a lot of time with skills and HR and talent, and then a lot of time in supply chain also, because it's about connecting the dots. That's the most interesting thing to me. And when I go to events, I do meet people who are much more like narrow focused. And I remember when I was a little more like that, and I'm glad I'm not. But there's advantages too to being narrow focused, because like you could probably have some guests on your show that were maybe a little bit more intimately following certain vendors than me these days. So pros and cons, right? But you try to find the way to make your voice the best for it can be, and there's no roadmap for that. You just have to follow your gut instincts, I guess.
Yeah. Well, speaking of gut instincts, let's jump into it. What are the when you look at the ERP market over the last 12 months, or let's just call it the broader enterprise technology space over the last 12 months, what are the biggest shifts you're seeing? Or maybe the ones, I know there's AI, there's all agentic AI, all this other stuff everyone's talking about, but what's under the surface? What's kind of stuff are you seeing or thinking that is happening here in this space that we're not talking enough about that people should be aware of?
Well, you gave me like a preview of some of these questions. I was like, thanks, Eric. I have to tell you like what people are talking about right now besides AI, um,
I know. Good luck.
which is a hard question, but no, it's a good one though because I do think there is more going on, and I is as much as I'm trying to dig into AI deeply, like it's really important to look at things that are not about that dynamic. I mean, I think uh, one of the really overriding things right now in the ERP space that I think some people have missed is the degree to which we're really talking about vertical applications now and industry applications. I mean, every single vendor, when you listen to them, they will talk about the industries they're focusing on and the functionality they're trying to build for that. And this is honestly a long time coming, but basically what it is, I sometimes call it the death of the green screen. But the it's just no longer tenable to have kind of a vanilla horizontal ERP that isn't catered to the needs of your industry. And more, you need to break down these application and data silos in order to be effective. And and by effective, what you really are thinking is how do we serve our customers better? How can we adapt faster to market conditions? How can we adjust our business models faster? This is the nature of today's economy. It's volatile, it's difficult, and even the software of a few years ago feels archaic for the challenges we have now, let's face it, for the most part. And so you need something different and better. And a really good step is to have your vertical and your ERP running on the same platform instead of having your proprietary vertical software be this like separate older technology. It needs to run on the same. And more that should be a baseline expectation. I don't know if you feel this way because you advise buyers on this. I just don't see how you can upgrade your ERP and then have a separate vertical stuff going on. Now, granted, there are gonna over time, right? I mean, obviously, you're gonna have some specialized vertical applications. I get that, but in general, this idea of running different vertical apps, I think, is really an archaic notion. And some of the ERP vendors are still playing into more of a horizontal thing, and customers too. And I really think they need to stop. So that's sort of one of the biggest things that I would point to.
Mm,
I also think there's a kind of uh, a scary slash healthy lack of confidence in big ERP upgrades right now. And I say scary and healthy at the same time. And I'd love for you to help me pick this apart a little bit because I
yeah.
think on the one hand, I think it's really healthy to say, wait, like I don't I don't have an appetite for another mega project. Like where's the world going to be in 2 years, and why am I doing this mega project? So I think that's really healthy. But the scary part to me is that sometimes I think what I see a little bit is customers frozen in place by the pace of change and not able to press ahead with ambitious projects. And I'm not saying
Mm,
that the ERP migration should be that project, but I do get frustrated when I see a lack of ambition and appetite for change. And
yeah.
I don't think it's good to get flatlined by these changes into a point of paralysis. And so I don't think that modernizing your ERP is necessarily the way forward for all customers, but I get a little disturbed when I see kind of a lack of appetite for anything ambitious in scope. And we could talk more about that. But so I think it's kind of a mix of like really healthy, but also a little scary.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's a great point, and it's I tend to try to expose the hidden scary part because I don't think people think enough about that sometimes. But you're right. If you think too much about that, it can be easy to say, well, shit, if stuff's going to change so much, and if if AI is going to disrupt everything, and we know this is a risky project, why? I'll just wait and see. I'll sit on the sideline and wait and see how technology evolves and develops. On the other hand, you don't want to. We have a lot of customers that are using, call it a legacy system. It's on prem. They've only been using it for say 5 to 10 years, and I think those are the ones I worry about because you're kind of in that middle ground where you haven't really gotten the full value out of what you already invested in, but
Yeah.
there's newer stuff out there. So how do you manage that? And I think the key is just you've got to prioritize it just like any other investment. Whether it's building a new factory or if you're going to do an acquisition or any other capital investment, you've just got to prioritize how important is an ERP or a
Right.
technology infrastructure modernization versus other stuff you might pursue. And I think only leadership within the organization can decide that. But it is a good point. It's a tricky balance that I haven't really seen before in my career.
Yeah, and I mean, I think I do make a little bit of an exception for AI sometimes because, like, AI is a conversation you do need to have as an organization because it gets at the core of how you feel about your human workers and what you want them to feel about their jobs. So you have to be talking about it. But I still maintain that transformation should be fundamentally technology free, the initial discussion, right? It shouldn't be about ERP. It shouldn't be about supply chain software. It shouldn't be about anything. It should be about what is our vision of how we're going to compete going forward? Who are we going to be? Who are we trying to serve? And what's getting in the way of that? How are we going to get there? You really can't have that be a technology centric conversation at first. And there's such a tendency to want to defer to your existing investments and your existing providers in that conversation. But I think you need to start at the top, which is one reason why I think I've always enjoyed your work, is because that's where you seem to enter the picture a lot of times, is before those conversations happen. And I think that's so healthy. And I still don't see enough of that. And when I go to events, probably a minority of the customers I interact with, like under 5%, can speak to an overall transformation strategy they're a part of and where they're headed. It's an idealistic thing to even run into that. And I'm just like, wait, aren't you aligned with what your company's trying to do as a whole? And it's like,
Yeah.
well, no, we're just trying to keep our heads above water, or we're just trying to help management understand this or that. And it's like, oh my God. I'm like, where are we going in this industry, Eric? We've been trying to get there our whole career. And like,
I know
so
you and I were at an event recently, and we were pontificating about how we're becoming the old cranky guys complaining about
I know.
how things are going in the industry, which is in some ways true. But what's interesting is you're hitting on a really, really important root cause that maybe addresses your first question, or that healthy, the thing that's healthy and scary at the same time, around companies that are asking tough questions. They're asking the why, but it's leading a lot of organizations to have analysis paralysis. I wonder if the real issue isn't so much should I or shouldn't I take on this big mega project, or should I or shouldn't I improve my technology infrastructure, but more what you just said. Should I first just get my ducks in a row, get aligned, get in sync, get a clear vision and strategy for what I want this project to be, and then go execute it? Because I think that's the challenge, is the reason these projects are so scary and so risky and they have such a high failure rate isn't because the technology sucks. It's typically because the organizations can't consume it. They can't, or they just don't know what to expect when trying to consume it. So I wonder if that is the real answer, is not do you or don't you go through these mega projects, but more, how do you do it in a way that fits your business, has a clear vision, has a clear strategy, just clarity in general. If you do that, then I think your likelihood of success is a lot higher.
So this is really interesting because, like, you and I are probably going to talk a bit about agentic AI and how that impacts the ERP space and all that. But like, the role of technology versus culture and change in our industry is really interesting because, like, in like 1997, I think I was a new newsletter I was really excited about. In addition to, like, I had an SAP one, I think I might have had an ERP that I had extending the enterprise. And the whole idea was, I felt so strongly that to get this stuff right, you had to look beyond the walls of your own enterprise. You had to understand what your customers needed, what your suppliers needed. It needed to all be part of the same frame. And I think that was the right vision even back then. But let's be honest, the technology really wasn't there to support that. I mean, if you really tried, you could build some point to point integrations between maybe your supply chain and your ERP, or maybe your CRM and your ERP. But these were big, massive projects that weren't easy, right? But if you fast forward to today with that same vision, I think to a large extent, the technology is there to accomplish that now. So the technology really is not the barrier anymore.
Right.
And so it does enter this provocative question, which is, well, what is getting in the way? I mean, yes, some of the AI stuff is kind of half baked, and we can get into that, but there's enough good technology now to enable a lot of the things that you and I have always wanted. So when it doesn't happen, it gets kind of awkward because it's like, well, why aren't you there? And the answer lies, of course, in the complexities of culture and politics and business model alignment, and just how you fit into your industry and your ecosystems, where there can be some dominant players, and then how do you compete against them, and how do you find the ways to do that? And we're so much conditioned these days to these economies of scale in what we do. We commit to certain platforms on our phones or in how we do our shopping. and it presents a lot of competitive challenges for individual companies to figure out. And so, yeah, I don't see it very often, but I will say sometimes one things I know you and I ran into each other at 𝗓𝗂𝘃𝗃𝗃 show, but one things I like about going down market sometimes is I find there's a better chance of having a refreshing conversation with an organization that's really on the same page,
Yeah.
but it might be a much smaller player. But it is really cool to 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 talk with an organization that really does have that. But in a larger enterprise, it's really, really hard to find an example of a big publicly traded company that's executing on all cylinders, that's not one of these tech behemoths.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, great point. And I think that the key that you mentioned here is, throughout my career, I've always struggled with a very binary question of whose fault is it when these projects fail. It's got to be
Yep.
one party. It's got to be the client. It's probably the vendor, probably the system integrator. It's got to be one of those parties. And the more I evolve or just learn, I feel like it's the combination of all three. All three:
Yep.
the vendor, your implementer, you yourself, the implementing organization. It seems to come together to this perfect storm where you're all doing things that are leading to failure. Now, if you can break that cycle and break the machine of failure, then obviously you can be one of the ones that succeed. But it's hard, to your point. It's hard for especially a lot of big organizations to have the backbone and the foresight and the internal alignment to be able to make tough decisions that allow you to break that cycle. I think that's one of the big challenges that we see.
Yeah, and I tend to be defensive of customers in
Right.
this sort of triangle of this, just because a lot of times they're dealing with these massive consultancies and massive vendors with massive marketing budgets and massive amounts of data on their projects. And
And
so when the
influence too, like
yeah,
a lot.
and when the projects go south, I tend to be like much more critical of the vendors and systems integrators than the customers. But I do acknowledge a lot of times that customers have a difficulty with this and then play the blame game. One of the things that I wish I could name the names here, because this is maybe offline we can do it, but some of you may know the names of these two personalities. But a number of years ago, there was an individual that was writing a lot about project failure and was essentially saying all three parties are to blame, right? And
Mhm.
that was the whole theme. And then another one of my colleagues took him to task and said, "Wait, that's not good enough, because if you have a car accident, for example, hopefully no one does, but someone goes out and assigns blame to that
Right.
situation and allocate fairly or not, they apportion the blame." And so
Right.
he said, "You need to be apportioning blame." And where I came out of that dialogue from was that on a case by case basis, we need to have the courage to kind of say, not to point fingers at any one situation, but every situation is different, but there is differences. There's times where the customer has more accountability. There's times where the systems integrator does. But in general, it takes all these parties to screw up a project, and that's just the reality of it, you
Yeah,
know?
I totally agree. I'm going to come back to that point in a second here. I want to get to the audience though, and thank you to the audience for all your questions and comments so far. Patrick on LinkedIn says,
Hey,
"Hi, Eric. Hi,
Patrick.
John. Greetings from Poland. More than happy to hear about your perspective." Um, Jan Hendrick on LinkedIn says, "Hi, Eric and John. It's great to be here. Would you shed some light on the AI terminating ERP topic?" Hold that thought, John, because I want to get to that because that's a big one.
Yes.
Is AI going
Okay.
to kill ERP?
Yes,
That's
we
a
will do
question.
that.
Darian on LinkedIn says, "Good morning. Good morning, Darian." Sanjay on LinkedIn says, "Hello." Couple questions I'm going to skip over right now, but we'll come back to them. Um, here's an interesting comment from Juan Edgar on LinkedIn. Juan Edgar says, "An important point that perhaps requires an entire chapter is change management with people. Many expect a salary increase or promotion or simply to keep their old position, which often doesn't happen." Thank you for this interesting session. So very much in sync with what you just said about change management culture. Those are all things, and people obviously can influence and do influence the outcome.
And one thing that I talk with customers about is what I find fascinating is that customers don't approach AI automation and talent necessarily the way that I would. So I'll tell you what my bias is. I want to see customers competing by using these technologies to excuse me, to elevate people and to make them feel more fulfilled in their jobs and feel more empowered, and essentially use these technologies to take away things like admin and grunt work and help them do more. And they might have to change roles at times to achieve some of that, but I want to see them getting more of the good stuff, and I want clear communication on how we're using these tools, and we're not using them to surveil you and make you feel under a microscope, uh, but we're embracing a continuous improvement kind of world here, and we want you to be a part of it. And a lot of the companies that really inspire me on the smaller companies are really kind of doing that in their own way, though they don't always do it exactly like I would want. But what they're doing is they're communicating what that philosophy is, which gets back to this change comment, which is people have a right to know what kind of changes to expect, at least if you want them to perform well. And unfortunately, right now, what I'm seeing more than often than not is that we're just creating a new shinier hamster wheel for people. And you could talk about how great the tools are all they want, but people are scared and they're working their asses off. And maybe they're being more productive and maybe they're not. We could debate that in terms of AI work slop and stuff like that. But overall, I'm pretty uninspired by a lot of the examples that I'm seeing around that. And a proper change initiative should move beyond that and make people see, like, okay, look, like we may have to be a little more efficient here. We may not be able to hire as many people as we wanted for this team, but here's where we're headed. Here's where you can grow. Here's how you can have an impact. And I'm not seeing enough of that.
Yeah, I totally agree. So let's come back to this question then from Jan Hendrik on LinkedIn. Could you shed some light on AI terminating ERP topics? So in other words, maybe we just broaden the lens here and looking at this and look at it from an even broader perspective of how does AI fit in with ERP? Do I need to upgrade my ERP system to get to AI? Should I be implementing AI now, even if I've got a legacy system? Should I separate the two? AI and ERP is two different things. Will ERP get consumed by AI or vice versa? How do you see AI and ERP coexisting, or do they coexist?
So let's take a little while to unpack this one, because this one has a whole lot of dynamics to it. The short version is that using AI to rebuild transactional systems for the most part doesn't make sense, especially for larger organizations. AI sucks, for example, at building general ledgers. I just got back from an analyst event around AI for finance. AI doesn't really understand finance terminology. Vendors that have a depth of background in finance have a much better advantage when it comes to kind of building out AI on top of their platforms. But in general, I think you have to take a little bit of a step back and say, in general, this AI versus ERP thing is a little bit of the wrong framing, but it is healthy from this perspective, which is that all the vendors in our industry have been a little too comfortable, and now they're not, and that's healthy. What's unhealthy is all the irrational market crap, like where you release Claude code or whatever, and a bunch of stocks take a pounding immediately. That's
Yeah.
not a healthy dynamic, because that's investors voting with their dollars who don't understand the enterprise and don't understand enterprise technology and don't understand that what you can build at home with Claude code over the weekend is not generally going to move the needle for organizations, especially in compliance-based industries that have a lot of strict issues around role-based access to information, all of that. You just can't build that stuff over the weekend. So that's not healthy. But what is healthy is that no one feels comfortable anymore. And one of my biggest disappointments, Eric, around SaaS is that while I'm a big advocate of multi-tenant cloud-based ERP and the economies of scale behind it for the most part, the fundamental industry issues never really changed. Like there's still so much friction engaging with vendors. Projects are still too expensive, and that needed disruption. And and it's come, and that's really, really healthy. And so I welcome the conversation. I just don't like the investor market side of this is a little bit misleading. Now, when
Yeah.
it comes to AI, like and the potential of AI, what are some of the things that people are drawn to in the enterprise context? Okay, well, one of them is making better decisions. So one of them is, can we so the way AI works in an agentic capacity when we're talking about LLMs, LLM agents, and LLM decision making is being able to pull in information from a variety of sources that you never could really do before, both structured and unstructured information. And I love the idea of starting there and talking to executive teams and saying, when you're making supply chain decisions, what information do you need? Do you need information on ports? Do you need weather information? Do you need to combine that with your own internal supply chain? Like, how do you get all of that together? And if you can do that, that's pretty cool. And then there's this other part, which is more about automation, which is how can we just do stuff faster, better, and more efficiently? Now, how autonomous we can do it with these agents remains to be seen. And I talk about granular autonomy because I think we have to be careful with how much autonomy, how fast. So that's autonomous work is another piece. And the third piece is that I think is most exciting is business model reinvention and growth. How do we use these technologies to literally invent new business models? Now some of that can be a little bit rocky. So, for example, with Walmart and OpenAI, this was really interesting because Walmart just dumped OpenAI in an experiment with integrating commerce directly into chats, right? So you see consumer behaviors changing. They're researching products in the context of their chats with OpenAI and other models. So why don't we just let them do checkout right from there, right? But the problem was that they didn't have enough of the data of availability and inventory, right? And so you're trying to check out, but you're not getting the proper information. And that in a nutshell is why a lot of these deals around the promise of agents go south is because they don't have access to enough of the information to fulfill what they need. And so uh, the other piece of that then is that Walmart's going to not giving up on this at all. Walmart's now going to try to do their own. They have, I think it's Sparky is the name of their, I can't remember, but they're going to feed it with their own real-time data. And so far they're seeing internally some better results. We'll see how that goes. But anyway, the point being, like, things are moving quickly. Now, the other thing that's really interesting that we have to put into this is the user experience component, right? And Eric, you're totally familiar with this one because ERP just never got user experience right. I don't care if it's on premise or SaaS or whatever. Now, look, some of the SaaS vendors have done a much better job with being able to do stuff on mobile and all of that. And some of the approval based functionality on mobile is really good. Like, I just approved some stuff while I was at my kid's soccer game or whatever. But in general, the user experience has just been unsatisfying. And so you can totally see the seductive temptation of, hey, you could just interact with the prompt and that will be it.
Yeah.
Like, and just ask for the information you need. It will take care of everything you want. And it's got a seductive power, but the problem is these are probabilistic systems that give the impression that they always do what you want, but the internet is rife with examples of where they don't. And so vendors have to figure out how to conquer all of that. So I'll wrap up this answer in a second, but in general, modern ERP, modern SaaS ERP is a really good basis for absorbing AI functionality because in the process of migrating to modern SaaS ERP, you had to do a lot of data quality work. So
Right.
it's not that SaaS ERP has some magical qualities. It's just that it enforced data discipline on the organization within the context of that area. And also, a lot of SaaS ERP did a really good job with workflow automation tools because they had a level of standardization. So, in fact, at the conference you and I were at, Eric, I went to a business rules automation session that had nothing to do with AI, that was standing room only. Like, people all over the back room because they know that they can set up all these deterministic automations within that context as well. And guess what? That's really powerful when it comes to agentic AI also because you can invoke more reliable automations with that agent. So the agent can ask you, do you want me to process this invoice? And instead of the agent trying to process it, it just invokes the workflow that's already built. And so that's why SaaS ERP can be an advantage, but that doesn't mean that you're necessarily screwed on older releases. It's just that what vendors need to prove now is that they're more than just data repositories. And anyway, there's no one right answer to all of this, and every customer is going to have to explore it for themselves.
Yeah. You bring up a really interesting point. This is why I love having you on the show and talking to you, John, because I always learn something new or just get multiple aha moments. But one aha moment that comes to mind is that, you've got this competing, these two competing schools of thought on what technology should be. On one hand, you've got AI, which is the allure, the sexy temptation to be able to just use a prompt and to hell with data structure, to hell with discipline. I can just use this chatbot or this agentic AI mechanism to do everything I need. I don't have to worry about transaction codes or finding stuff on a menu driven thing anymore. I can just go ask a prompt. And then you've got ERP, which has always been really good at for all the warts that ERP systems have. The one thing they're really good at is structure, workflows, systems of record, having a single source of truth. All that stuff has always been the appeal of ERP. And those two worlds are in conflict here. And I'm just curious, how it ends up settling. It's like on one hand, yeah, you've got to have that core backbone, that core infrastructure. But on the other hand, I guess here's another question for you, Jonathan. If I'm an SAP user, let's just say I'm on ECC, and I'm thinking about, do I go with S/4HANA, go through, say, a 2, 3, 4-year implementation to then just maybe be able to use Joule and some of the agentic AI capabilities that SAP's invested tons of money in? Or is there something, or do I stay on ECC and try to use a different AI tool in some other way that's available to me now? Like, how do you see those two worlds coming together, at least in the short term? Because I think that's where a lot of our clients are struggling. Do I go all in on a new ERP? Do I just focus on AI? Do I have to do both?
So it's a really interesting question, and there's not easy answers to this. I mean, in the longer view, I'm not optimistic about your chances running legacy software for anything, whether it's ERP, CRM, supply chain, anything. I'm not optimistic, but not all legacy software is created equal either. I just talked with a vendor about this who has legacy footprint, and one of the things they're really going to focus on is putting really good APIs on top of that software, and that's going to enable more AI processes. Now, the vendor's taking a risk there, because just because you built APIs for that customer doesn't mean they're going to choose you.
Right.
But it's the proper risk to take for the customer. Now, here's the problem, Eric, which is that not all ECC customers are created equal. A lot of it comes down to how much customizing of the code you did, because AI needs a level of data quality, especially when it comes to transactional stuff. It can do a little better with unstructured information on, it's trained on the internet, for Christ's sakes. But for transactional systems and repeatable processes, it needs more of a quality standard than a lot of companies have indulged in. And whether or not you modernize your ERP, you can't get away from that core issue. So I don't care whether you choose a best of breed agentic player or SAP or one of their partners. If you're on an old software and it's heavily customized, you're going to struggle with next generation AI capabilities at scale. Now, you might be able to pick an area where you do have some quality and get started. Here's one of the interesting things that I've been giving SAP a hard time about, and they're starting to come around somewhat, is that some of this is a messaging issue, because you can actually access a fair amount of AI capabilities through BTP on older releases, including some Joule. So if I were talking with an SAP customer about upgrading, one of the things I would say is get started on AI now with SAP, and tell SAP you want to see what you can do with their AI right now before you move. And so work with them to pick an area where you do have some decent level of data quality, and where you can work maybe with a partner or SAP or both to build some kind of AI-driven application via BTP, or maybe using SAP's Business Data Cloud or some variation of that, or maybe a different platform of your choice that SAP works with, like Databricks or Azure or whatever, and build something that you need. Build something that will help you. Maybe it's automating some invoice recognition in a way that you haven't been able to do in the past, or maybe it's some kind of supplier management triage where you alert suppliers to potential needs, or you get flagged with potential port lockups or whatever. But build something cool and useful now, and challenge SAP, or for that matter, any vendor in that situation, to demonstrate that they can do something now. Because in fact, there is not a technical barrier to it. And that's the misconception that has been put in the market. You don't have to do that to consume Joule. Now, look, a lot of vendors will enjoy a little bit of that confusion because they want you to upgrade, but there's a downside too. And what I tell vendors, including SAP, is you need to become an innovation partner to all of your customers right now without having to upgrade your ERP. Prove that they can innovate now. And that, if I'm a customer, I start there and see how well it goes. Because a lot of AI is so different than ERP. AI is very iterative. You have to constantly fine-tune the models, constantly experiment with your data, constantly try different approaches to see if you're getting a better result. You're constantly tuning it. So get started and see. And if you really like the flavor of AI you get with SAP, well, that's one more argument for making the upgrade. But if you don't like the result, well, I think that's an argument for not doing the upgrade. And the other thing that I would do is I would press SAP on, you know, the APIs that you need, not just for working with them, but working with any other vendor and say, look, I don't know if I can move right now, but I want better data access inside my system. And honestly, you got to do a bake off and see who has the best vision and what you're looking for. And this is how ERP has changed, Eric, is that you have to look at ERP much more now, not as a standalone application, but as a so-called ecosystem and a platform where the data considerations are crucial, and also how the partners are building. Because think of it this way: why would you want to work with a best of breed agentic player when you could work with a partner of your chosen vendor and continue to build on their platform? Because you have to think about what happens at scale. What happens when you have hundreds of these agents? Wouldn't it be better if they were all on the same platform?
Right.
So start seeing who has the healthiest platform, who has the best partners, and don't upgrade until you're starting to get satisfied that you have a future on that platform. And I think that's a radically different way of looking at upgrades that I think makes more sense.
Yeah, and that's interesting. And if I'm a software vendor, if I'm SAP in this example, I actually really like that strategy. I should like that strategy, because now what you're doing is, okay, we've tried for a few years now with the high stakes, all or nothing. You're not going to get support. You got to go to S4 HANA. Okay, you got a certain number of customers that bid on that and said, okay, we're moving to S4 HANA, and now we can be upgraded. We can be fully modernized. We can now use Joule, all that stuff. Even though, to your point, we could be using Joule anyway potentially. But set that aside for a second.
Right. Yeah.
So you've converted a certain number of our customers, but they're struggling to get that next wave. There's another wave that's kind of sitting there saying, I don't know, like I just finished my ECC implementation 5 years ago, not quite ready to invest 50 million in an S4 HANA implementation. What if you were to offer a more incremental buy-in? It's a way to keep these people engaged with your ecosystem. With SAP in this example, you keep them engaged with your brand, with your product, even if it doesn't mean right now they're moving everything over S4 HANA. So if you can give them Joule in a way that, okay, maybe it's not as lucrative as a big S4 HANA purchase, but you still got some more incremental revenue. You've for lack of a better word, you've locked them in a little bit more into your ecosystem. And eventually they're going to be more likely now to say, okay, this is pretty cool. If I did, now I can see the value of going to S4 HANA, because now I've got a faster database, better data structure, all the benefits of S4 HANA. So I think it's a good strategy. If I'm a vendor and I just take a step back and listen to what you just said, that's a pretty solid strategy that I would think would build a lot more trust and would help this trust gap we're seeing in the industry too.
Yeah, and I've pushed this on a lot of vendors, including SAP, and it's generally been well received. And yeah, because vendors understand they need to be innovation partners to their customers, and they know that there's AI pure plays going into those older code bases and saying, look, we can do this for you. You don't have to move. And all I'm saying to warn customers about is be careful, because AI is a referendum on your data quality. And if you have a messy, complicated legacy footprint, whether or not you upgrade, to a new ERP or not, you're going to be disappointed in your AI results when your data and application silos are everywhere. And I'm not making this up. We just published a couple things on this week, and we just published research from Valois on our site about all the data silos in CRM and how that's presenting this problem. And I just used the OpenAI example as well. So you have to reckon with the state of your data regardless. And so I just want to warn customers about that, because you're going to be really, really disappointed. And what customers are doing is it's a mixed bag, because I think they're getting seduced into trying to take some AI shortcuts, and you see it all the time with like putting up chatbots to give out wrong information and all of that. But then it's also sparking a healthy conversation, Eric. And this is where I think you and I, even though we might be skeptical of certain aspects of the technology, we can embrace this part, which is AI provokes finally the conversation around organizational silos that we've been wanting to have for so long. And now we can really have that conversation. And that's what I would urge customers is, regardless of whether you upgrade your ERP or not, start having that conversation. Because you say, oh, SAP's clean core is a marketing gimmick. Okay, maybe it is, but honestly, they're right about moving towards a clean core in your product. Whether you ever go off on-prem software or not, for you may have reasons for air gap systems in your industry or whatever it is, but you need to stop accumulating technical debt in non-differentiating areas. And whether or not you ever do business with a vendor like SAP again, clean core is correct. That is the correct way to approach software, and you should differentiate with careful judgment and generally in an application mentality where you differentiate with applications, not custom code.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot. Yeah, there's a lot in there in what you just said. I think, really important point about differentiating, the things that aren't important for you to customize. Absolutely. You go to, I mean, that's low hanging fruit to move to clean core now. But it's interesting to hear you say that the vendors are open to it. I do wonder if maybe the mentality of vendors will shift over time from being a pure product company that focuses so much on the roadmap, like, okay, S/4HANA, let's convert as many people as we can to S/4HANA. Who knows what's next after S/4HANA? But in every vendor does it this way. It's a very sequential, linear, somewhat of a one size fits all path or a journey that we're trying to move our customers down. What if we were to say, look, we are a technology innovation company, like you said, and we just provide tools that might vary depending on where the client is and what their maturity is, what their appetite is, all that stuff. I think it's a different mindset that might actually serve the industry really well and avoid some of these one size fits all massive failures. Because a lot of reasons these failures happen because we're all trying to do the same thing when we all are different, right?
Yeah, prove to me I can innovate now, and then let me think about making a big move. We've never thought of our industry that way before, and it's really healthy. And that's the healthy part of this conversation. And, you know, part of the reason they're open to it, Eric, of course, is because they're scared, because they don't want to become an API call for someone else's AI driven relationship with their customer, right? Because whoever controls the user experience controls the relationship, right? And so if I'm going into your portal to do my work in my, whether it's an agentic thing or whatever, I have a real edge, and no one wants to become the back end data call to someone else's sexy next generation API platform. And so they're scared. I would say to them, look, there's other vendors going in and making this pitch right now to your legacy customers. They can get started with AI right now. Whereas your official marketing literature says that they have to upgrade first, like that they have to climb this 2 or 3 year mountain before they can consume your AI. Does that make any sense? Especially when you peel it back, there's almost no technical barriers to doing it now, as long as the data quality is there. Now, occasionally there are certain kinds of functionality that require certain release components, but it's incredibly minor. So vendors listen, Eric, but the problem is, are they doing it in lockstep throughout their organization? Does it get across to marketing? Does marketing hit the right tone with it? But the whole idea is that if I'm a modern vendor, what do I want most from my customers? No matter what, I'm ERP, CRM, or whatever. I think those monikers are going to go away, by the way. But what I want are two things. I want to be perceived as an innovation partner, and I want to be perceived as a trusted platform. I want you to trust me as part of your platform landscape, and I want to be one of your go-tos. And so if that's your goal, then you got to do it now with your other customers. You can't make them jump through hoops anymore. Oh, and by the way, you have third-party maintenance providers extending these deadlines. So any customer that feels bullied into moving ahead, stop right now. You don't have to. Just stop.
Right.
Like these things have been pushed out extremely far now, 2040, I think. So you are not in a rush. Like, take your time with this.
Yeah, that's the key right there. Just do it on your own time frame. And I think the focus, I think what you're really touching on, it seems to me, is that you're focusing on getting us all focused on outcomes.
Yep.
That's really what vendors should be thinking about as their product. Their product is business value. Their product is business transformation. It's not S/4HANA. It's not Dynamics 365. It's not Oracle Fusion. That's not the product you're selling. And I think that's a problem with our industry. As a fellow tech guy or technologist, I get this where the shiny object, the sexy, cool thing, you're just so excited about it. You're focused on it. You're building a solution or a product versus an end outcome, which is what we should all be focused on.
Yeah, like in Seattle where you and I were together, I interviewed a customer and they essentially have to build a different business model for each client. Every client's sort of a custom job. And it's all automotive, but each one's a little different. And so I was like, I wanted to catch him in a customization riddle. So I was like, are you having to customize your software and redo all this stuff for each of these clients? And he was like, nope. Like we've been able to do this in the context of our deployment, and we can tweak some things and do it differently for each customer. And I'm like, and they're not doing a lot of AI yet. They're going to do more, but that's what I want to hear. Like I want to hear that you can move at the pace of today's markets with the platform that you have without being heavily reliant on IT. Because while I'm pretty skeptical of like a lot of AI vibe coding stuff, what I am really interested in is how to empower companies to move quickly and not accumulate technical debt in the process of doing that. And that, of course, is highly disruptive to the SIs that you and I have been, the large ones in particular, that you and I have been critical of for a very long time.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I want to come back to a related question from Darian on LinkedIn. She asked the question of, are we overestimating how fast AI will transform enterprise operations? And you started to touch on this earlier. You started touching upon how it's a bit of confusion and not a lot of clarity as far as how AI can impact or help organizations. Where do you see? What are your thoughts on this question? What's your knee-jerk reaction to that?
Oh yeah, I think we are overestimating. I mean, look, a lot of the so-called mass layoffs so far blamed on AI had nothing to do with AI, except for the fact that it's freeing up money for things like data center build outs and, the heavily celebrated Block AI layoffs. I've researched that extensively, and it looked to me like Block was trying to compensate for overhiring during the pandemic, which is a common bugaboo, and then being overinvested in crypto. And it's their name is Block for blockchain, so that gives you some idea of how invested they are. So the point is like AI is not as near term disruptive. And one of the reasons, it's a great question, by the way, and one of the reasons is because this generation of AI is so dependent on proper data and context, and the really impactful AI that we want needs that because the generic productivity tools that we find in our office applications and stuff like that, let's be honest, they're not really changing how we do work all that much. I mean, it wrote an email for you with, I mean, come on.
Right.
Um, but one of the reasons for that, when I wrote my agentic AI projects piece that is live now on Diginomica, I outlined three things that are different about enterprise AI versus like the large frontier models. And more getting enterprise AI right is less about these, massive frontier models. And it's about three things. It's about context at the time of inference, which means getting the best information at any moment in time for that particular company and user in a well-governed way. The second thing is constraining LLMs in what I call a compound systems architecture, where it's not a standalone LLM, but it's connected with other forms of machine learning, deterministic workflow systems, which I refer to either external tool calls to verifiers, sources of database truth, knowledge graphs, things like that. And then a very promising distinction between off-the-shelf frontier models and domain-specific smaller models informed by relevant data. The smaller models can be much more targeted. I'm about to publish today about a finance-specific model and what a difference that can make for finance users. But here's the thing. These three components and getting that built into AI is going to take a long time. That's not the AI that we've seen so far. So when you see the studies like PwC saying that, only 10% of AI products have seen a return on investment, and this was a survey of 4,000 CEOs, that, in my opinion, mostly harkens back to earlier generations of the technology that we've tried to use for more generic applications that hasn't worked. In fact, it's a pretty sophisticated architecture I just described. And most customers, Eric, can't build what I just laid out because it's complicated managing all of that stuff, accounting for model drift, diffusing larger models into smaller ones, training models on specific data, customizing them at scale for different customer needs. A typical customer can't get the most out of that. And so it's going to take a while. And so AI is not going to radically transform the landscape, but in the long run, it is going to be a part of how we do business. I don't think there's any question about that. And I just encourage companies to not to reject a lot of this autonomous enterprise, crap and just exaggeration, and look at, a more careful look at what can we automate, where can we apply our talent in the best ways, how do we make it all work. It's that talent automation balance is a big part of it. And then can we free up time not just for human relationships, but also for next gen business model expansion and being more strategic and creative in how we do things. And if you can do that, you're on your way. But I haven't run into very many organizations that have reached that point yet.
Yeah, it's like we've missed the fundamentals, the core foundational stuff you need to do well and do right in this industry in order to succeed. So the technology can change and advance all at once, but we're going to continue to have these struggles until organizations figure out how to get that foundation right before they start building on it.
Yeah, and think of AI, think of today's AI systems as not truly intelligent, because if they were, they wouldn't need so much specific data all the time. That I call it a facsimile of intelligence because it resembles intelligence when you architect it properly, but it's not the same as human intelligence. It's not, you know, I only have to put my hand on a hot stove once to know not to do it again. Whereas with AI, you have to train it again and again, the same thing. And so for that reason, it takes a while to architect this, and your messy enterprise is not a good fit with today's AI. So you have to find the areas where you're not as messy and where you're more precise, and then build from there. And but the good news is that it can be iterative and you can build on momentum. And so one of the things I talk about in my what's I have things that aren't working in AI projects and things that are. And one of the things that is working is what I call AI readiness, which is pick an area where your data isn't up to par and develop that and do some process improvement or some analytics improvements or whatever. But the key is win as you go. And we've documented so many case studies on Diginomica of companies that have done just that, including nonprofits and companies that are on tight budgets, who have improved how they serve their constituents through these technologies, but gradually getting their house in order. And that's the exciting part. But while I think it's good to move away from mega projects, I don't think it's good to move away from a mega ambition to change. And that's the thing that I'm pushing back on a little bit.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I totally agree with you. I think those are all good points. What about you were talking about you were talking about, and you were just alluding to it again just a moment ago, Jon, about how AI essentially needs to be managed. And so we think about agentic AI in the enterprise. How do we leverage this cool technology in a way that makes us feel confident and comfortable that it's actually going to do what we want? So in other words, how do we be innovative but have the right guardrails and structure in place to make sure that we're managing AI? I think that's a muscle that a lot of organizations haven't figured out yet. Have you seen any tips or strategies that have worked there?
Well, so there's a whole bunch of different components to it, but there's a clear sense of governance, right? Which is not just go wild with building agents or whatever, but thinking about how they're going to plug into a governance framework and working with vendors that can help you build that for yourself and make sure that you're in compliance with whatever you're going to need from an auditing framework and all of that. One of the reasons why these contextual forms of AI feeding data context into the language model works so well is that the context gives you some traceability on your data, and you can build that into as you go. I mean, I encourage companies to take a step back first and think about things like the risk levels, like the EU AI Act. Some companies are beholden to, but even if you're not, it's really helpful to look at the risks that they assign to different types of AI related activities. So why not start with some low risk stuff, but low risk stuff that is still going to have impact for your customers, right? Maybe you want to take on the where's my stuff problem in a whole new way, and help customers see or troubleshoot on some of their deliveries in real time or something. And maybe you find some low risk things you can work on that will give you some new opportunities. So low risk is key, and governance is key, and explainability is key. And then that iterative thing of starting small and evaluating results. But one of the biggest things is just knowing, like, where is the data getting pulled for these responses? What does the data architecture look like for me? And making sure, obviously, that the that the system's not going to train on your stuff, and that it's, because when you build this right, it doesn't have to train on your stuff. It just incorporates it at the time it makes a decision, but it doesn't become part of the model itself. And so anyway, you got to do all this homework. So you're going to need trusted partners. And so you probably can't do it on your own for the most part, unless you're a very sophisticated shop. So find partners that you trust. And I think it might be a combination of working with some of your existing providers, but also looking at new ones. But just be a little careful with the new ones, that they can speak to the overall data platform that you're building instead of doing one-offs, because one-offs sound sexy at first. And I see all these on LinkedIn all the time. I just built this weekend for my company. I just blah, blah, blah. But what I'm missing is, how are you going to scale that and govern that in a secure way? And if you're not doing that discussion from the beginning, then I don't like your chances. And then, like I said, you need a philosophy on labor and talent, because if you're just taking an operational efficiency frame, you're not getting the most out of this technology. But also, a lot of times you're going in a headcount reduction mindset at the same time. Now, a lot of the customers that I talk with, they will tell you that when they're doing this properly, they're not hiring as many people. And so, okay, people are punching above their weight a little bit more. Maybe that's okay. But just kind of look after your workforce a little bit and figure out what your values are there. And my biggest advice is, don't treat this like it's an inevitable thing. Oh, it's AI, it's going to take over my company. Like, dictate your own pace and your own comfort level with this technology, and do it in targeted ways, and build momentum, rather than treating it like, oh, we got to be the first. And I hate these AI first things, because I want people to develop a culture of experimentation. So one of the first things you need is a safe sandbox that people can play around with and bring their own ideas to light. But not the shadow AI sandbox, or playing around with Chat GPT with your data, but
Yeah.
a secure environment. Because if you don't provide that secure environment to experiment, people are just going to go off and do whatever they want.
Yeah. Yeah. I totally agree. So looking forward, I mean, you and I have been doing this for close to the same amount of time. You look back over the last 30 years or so that you've been doing this, you've seen a lot of stuff. A lot of stuff has changed and evolved, and a lot of hype cycles that have busted and boomed. What do you see happening in the next 2 to 3 years? I mean, if you could predict the future, which is always a fun but futile exercise, but still fun to do. Where do you see this industry headed in the next 2 to 3 years? Big trends.
Well, it's really interesting. I mean, I think everyone's going to have to change, and I think some of it is good. I think, like, I really like that there's an increased focus on what value are we actually deriving. I think those are the questions we should have been asking all along. So I'm really glad to see those questions. I do think that we are probably going to see some differentiation between companies that really, like, kind of pursue these things as a discipline, versus, like, they just buy into the magic technology hype and try stuff that doesn't work. So I think it'll be really interesting to see if there's some new winners and losers that emerge from all of this. I mean, in the end, I don't think these product categories are gonna stand. I mean, I don't know if it's 2 years, but 5 or 10 years from now, it's hard to think about ERP and CRM and supply chain as these distinct systems. It feels more like composable workflows that we would want to have access to across different areas, that are building blocks for things we might want to build. I don't know if that's 2 years out, but that's probably a little further. But it does feel like we've outstayed our welcome with some of these acronyms. And some of that might be a really good thing, but we do have to be a little careful, because a lot of times when I get into these big pricing debates at these analyst events, I keep coming back to the fact that customers like predictability, and they might like new pricing models, but they also don't want to get stuck with a huge tab for consumption-based pricing and find out that their team was up all night, like, pushing the envelope with large language model calls, and, like, running up a tab. So predictability has to factor in, right? And so somehow we have to find this balance. I'm not sure where it's all headed, but I think these kind of conversations to me are the key. And I'm going to be really interested to see, like I'm rooting for, like, human talent to triumph in a way, because I think these conversations we're having too much right now are too mechanistic. And I think ultimately it should be about helping us be better people and serve better, and treat each other better. And I don't know if that's what's going to happen. So I think, man, I think we're going to see some really different examples. I think we're going to see some really dystopian examples, but I think we're going to see some really cool, interesting examples too. I mean, even with the same customer service agentic technology, I've seen projects that are totally dystopian where you can never find a human ever again.
Right.
Even when you need them. And I've seen some that are really deployed really well that seem to free people up from a lot of the routine stuff that was dragging them down, and get customers solving problems faster, but then talk to a human when they need to. And so much of this is about like like we're going to get called out on what our values really are, because if we're not careful, like this could bring out the worst in us, but I don't think it has to. So man, I'm not good with a crystal ball though, Eric. I mean, every time I think I have one, there's tariffs or there's a war or,
Right. A
I'm
pandemic.
sorry, I just can't give you a total good prediction. I don't know.
Yeah, I agree. I was hoping you had a different answer because I have the same problem. It's like just when you think you've got it figured out or you're starting to see where things are headed, you realize you don't. And I think that's where we're at right now. Is everything we're talking about. I mean, everything we've had to discuss in this conversation, it points back to uncertainty, change. I think you opened up by talking about, your response to that question was we all have to change. The industry, the customers, the buying customers, the people involved in this industry, we all have to change. And I think that's maybe the one constant, the one thing we can be certain of is that.
Yeah, and I would just say try to keep the markets at bay and stick with the game. One of my biggest fears, Eric, for vendors is that they get too distracted by the market valuations, and I think
Yes.
a lot of vendors are taking a pounding unfairly in some ways. And I've told vendors, just if you can stick with the long game of what you're trying to how you're trying to serve customers, you're going to be okay. But if you get distracted by these market things, it's not going to be okay. So again, I think we all need a little more sanity in our lives, and that's to me the biggest thing is like, can we push back from this sort of like maelstrom of noise and still deliver value? So that's a challenge I'm taking on for myself and for Diginomica as a team. We are, and can we deliver on it? I don't know, but I do know that projects continue to need independent voices, and so these kind of conversations that you and I are having now, to me, are the priceless ones. And I like having them with customers too, and I hope customers seek out their own peers as well. We need to have diverse, open conversations all the time right now, not just at events. And so I'm really glad you have these virtual formats, because we lose track of this stuff in between events, and we shouldn't, because virtual does have some power to extend the conversations that we shouldn't ignore.
Yeah, I agree. And as always, I appreciate you being here. You've always got great insights. I always learn a lot from you, and we need to do this more often. So really appreciate you being here today.
Yeah, always a pleasure, Eric. Thanks, man.
Yeah,
Thanks for
thanks
all
to
the
the
good
audience.
questions, by the way, everyone. Appreciate that. It was awesome.
Yeah, great questions. You've got quite the following, John. Clearly, because you've got a lot of super fans I know are on here of yours. So thanks for everyone for the great questions. We're gonna edit this podcast. We'll add some additional content. It becomes part of the Transformation Ground Control podcast episode officially next week. So if you haven't checked out that podcast, go to transformationgroundcontrol.com. If you'd like to see past episodes with Jon Reed on it, just search Jon Reed. When you go to that website, Transformation Ground Control, you'll find a handful of episodes that he's been on over the years. And you can see that every conversation is enlightening, a little bit different. So appreciate everyone being here. Hope you all have a great week, and we'll see you all next